You're listening to Real Conversations, where every week we take a peek at the favorite movies of fascinating people. Real Conversations is hosted by Bryan Coley, the founder of Art Within and Real.
Hi, I'm Kim Bird, and I'm going to be your guest host today on Real Conversations. And I am going to be turning the tables today on your normal host, Bryan Coley. And we are going to interview Bryan about his take on the Oscars this year, which is a little bit different from what you're used to, I think. Most people, when they think of the Oscars, I know for me, superficial or not, I love to see the stars, who shows up, who's winning, who's nominated, who's going to win, and what they're going to wear. But I think you have a little bit more of an unusual take on the Oscars, Bryan.
Yeah, well, it's a grand little party about people patting each other on the back and giving each other gold trophies. But for me, I think the Oscars is so much bigger. In fact, I think that God speaks through the Oscars. And I think that the Oscars are almost evidence that there is a God. If you don't believe in God, then I think the Oscars actually is the evidence.
Ooh, now that is kind of challenging, and that's a little bit tough for me to go with. Because I don't think of that. I mean, I think of the Oscars just being, these are just movies. They're entertainment. How on earth can you have something that big connect with God? It's superficial, right? I mean.
But if you think about it, the first reason I think that the Oscars are important is that art in itself is usually doesn't win out when it comes to commerce. So the little known secret behind the studios is that every year they usually have one slot in their slate of movies that is their Oscar film. And that's usually a passion project of an actor or a director. So these movies are done for the sake of what they have to say. You know, most of the actors are these great actors who want to get behind a project because it has something important to say. And so that very aspect of kind of art winning and triumphing usually gives movies like this license to say more, to take bigger risk. They're not bound by summer blockbusters that have to hit a certain demographic, and 4 quadrants is what they usually say, where it has to hit all 4 quadrants and do really well. Usually the Oscar film is that one film that the studio says, hey, we may take a loss on this, but our loss is gained by a golden trophy and the respect of critics and our fellow industry people.
So you're saying maybe like it's like a passion project. So you might even have big blockbuster actors take part in this because it's more of a meaningful film or something about a topic that really means something to them. Exactly.
So in that way, the thing that film is saying is probably important for us to hear. And if, I view these industry artists as the best of the best, right? These are the people who are great at their craft, whether it's acting or directing and so if all these great artists are coming around something that is important versus something that's just making money, then I think that in its very nature is going to be somewhat prophetic as to what it says. So for me, if you want to know what's going on in pop culture, if you want to kind of read the tea leaves of the times, then look at the box office. Those kind of hits are the things that tell us where we are. But if you want to think about, well, where are we headed as a culture, and how, what might be the themes and the things that we're advancing towards, I believe the Oscars are going to be more likely to tell us where we're headed.
So, like, for instance, can we take the winner of last year? I mean, would that
Sure.
be one that we can look at? So Spotlight won last year.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying, your theory is that Spotlight winning last year is giving us an indication of what's to come.
Yeah.
Explain that a little bit more to me.
In fact, last year was a great example. Almost every film last year that was nominated for the Oscars for Best Picture had some level of anti-establishment aspect to it. So Spotlight's kind of the
take them down. Yeah, take the church down. Really,
exactly. So it's like taking the big establishment that is the church and saying, okay, how can we take that down?
Wow.
But you could see that also in Mad Max. I mean, in Mad Max, it was about this kind of corrupt government that they were running away from. And if you could even take it to The Martian was up for Best Picture last year. And if you remember, the space program was kind of in the way. They weren't helping at all. It was actually, they actually had to go against the establishment to bring him home. And, I could go on and on. Big Short was nominated last year, and it was definitely about the financial institution and how it was a big takedown of the financial industry, right? So ironically enough, here we have a whole set of movies that's looking like this anti-establishment kind of films or this thread in them. And what do we have as last year, as far as our election, right?
Right.
Huge anti-establishment part of our society and part of our culture, and it leads to a very anti-establishment candidate who wins, right?
Wow, yeah, that's a good point. I've never thought about that, when tracing it back to last year's winner and kind of thinking about the year that came after. So I'm thinking through, how is it that all of these producers at one time, with what you're saying all of these producers all came together and came up with a theme, and then how did it all come together for 1 year?
No. That's part that I think that God's involved. There's no way in the world that there was this magic boardroom in Hollywood where they all sat down and said, okay, we're going to put all these movies together and have them happen to be nominated for an Oscar and happen to have this anti-establishment theme, for instance, for last year. To me, that's where I totally see it as a God thing, right? Because a movie takes, anywhere from 4 to 7 years, maybe even longer, to go from idea to distribution. So a lot of these projects started as just an idea way down the line. Then if you take on top of that the fact that this is just very, they say it's very hard to predict the box office, that nobody can predict whether something's going to be a hit. Well, it's just as hard to predict whether something's going to be an Oscar nominee. I mean, you may have the best actors, the best passion project, the best director, and it gets snubbed that year. One of the examples of this year is this past year is in 2016, a movie called The Birth of a Nation came out with Nate Parker made the film. And if there was ever a film that was kind of Oscar material, it won the film festival. It won Sundance Grand Jury Prize. It was touted by everyone who saw it there, critics alike. And here it is, a movie after the whole hashtag Oscar so white. Here's a movie that's totally about African American history and sort of, division as far as race is concerned. And it's historical. But all of a sudden it comes out in October, which is a little early for the Oscar season. And then it has a controversy behind it where the director and another person who made the film with him have been accused in their past of sexual abuse. And that whole episode in their real life kind of just took it out of the Oscar.
Yeah, it just blew up.
Exactly. It just took it out of the race. And so, it had to be an act of God, almost a miracle, that this film would not be the Oscar front runner, and yet it wasn't, and it's not. And so for me, the idea that how these films ultimately become Oscar nominees for Best Picture and how they happen to come together in the same year to say something so strong, to me, is only God can be behind that. And I know that's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that God is the ones who, and not all these executives and not all this politics and power in Hollywood, that's selecting who is the Oscar nominees. But providentially, I just believe he's the one that does it, because I've just seen year after year these really strong themes come out of the Oscars that seem to be shaping culture.
And you're right. Then at the end of the day, I mean, there are maybe 5 to 8 films that get nominated out of all the films that come out every week, all throughout the year, that these 5 are the ones that everyone's highlighting, and they all have different themes. So tell me more. I mean, you have me intrigued.
Well, I would say, a good example of this from the standpoint of years past was, and again, I'll come back to Donald Trump as probably the best example of how everything converged for Donald Trump to become president. And I know, people may be tired of hearing this kind of stuff or different people predicting why Donald Trump, but I want to kind of give a perspective that probably has never been brought out before. And that is that, after 9/11, we had a lot of films that kind of expressed the idea that hope which Obama was really big on in his platform, would come from outside of yourself. So if you think about the fantasy genre alone, then a lot of that is just all this kind of unseen forces, unseen powers.
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings was nominated in 2001, 2002, and 2003. It finally won in 2003 for Best Picture, each of the different trilogies.
Wow.
And to me, that was a huge ushering in of good versus evil, black and white. Everything from that before 9/11 was very postmodern, very gray. And then suddenly this fantasy genre comes in just full force. And then behind it is animation in full force, in which we can kind of see all kinds of different animals and places, unseen worlds. And all these animals are changing just like we want to change, And then we go into the superhero genre comes in. And then suddenly we're like the citizens of Gotham, in which all these villains that we can imagine in our world are taken care of by these outside forces, right? These superpowers, superheroes. So to me, we lived probably about 10 years after 9/11 with a flood of films saying your hope is from outside of yourself. For instance, if you think about Lord of the Rings, it's always Gandalf who has these eagles that fly in.
Right.
Or, he comes over the mountain, with the horse.
Gandalf the White versus Gandalf the Gray.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's kind of what we wanted. Or Superman sweeps in, or, and suddenly our villains are taken care of. And I think also during that time, our fear was expressed in all these disaster films and post-apocalyptic films. So you have not only the Hunger Games, in which you have a dystopian world, and will we survive after things kind of fall apart? But you also have disaster films like, The White House Down, or, or Sharknado.
Sharknado, for sure.
San Andreas Fault. All this kind of playing out these disaster drills to say, if everything goes down, will we be okay? Will we survive? And I bring up that word disaster because I think if there was one word that, if you remember from the campaign of Donald Trump, he kept saying, this is a disaster.
Right.
This is a complete disaster. The way they're doing foreign policy is a disaster.
Like we're getting ready. This is going to be the end. Everything is destroyed if we keep going.
Exactly.
Yes.
That we're living in this sort of disaster zone that Obama created, right? So he played upon the fear aspect of things. But there was another thing that was going on that after, 10 years of having hope outside of ourselves, if things don't change, which, hope and change were kind of linked together in Obama's platform, then what happens when change doesn't occur? What happens when we go through one of the biggest economic collapses and people's finances are not changing and those neighborhoods are not being built yet? And, we're watching sort of
people's day-to-day is falling apart. Everything in their day-to-day life is not working. It's not necessarily a fault or or an earthquake, but it's their day-to-day living that they can't make it in.
Or just simply, it's just not changing. Gas prices just are staying the same or something like that. They're not getting lower or better or anything like that. At least that happened a lot. I think now things are starting to recover a little bit more. We're starting to see evidence. But I would say during this time, for the last maybe 5 years, we have been looking for change, and change has not come that much. And so what happened in film, especially with the Oscars, this is bringing it back to the Oscars, is you started seeing films that were based on a true story. Like, for instance, in 2014, the Oscars, it was probably the first time in Oscar history where 6 of the 9 Oscar nominees were based on a true story. And then the following year, 5 of that year were based on a true story.
Those get me, though. Those get me.
Well, yeah. Why do they get you?
I think they get me for a couple of reasons. One, they're real people, and you see that people can achieve things and that things can change for them, and they can grow and evolve into this person that they need to be. But also, it's just very hopeful for me. I always cry at the end of those films when they show a real person.
Exactly.
The real picture, and you go, that person existed, and that person's just like me, and they got out, and they made it through horrendous things, and they still came out, and they survived, and they're intact.
Exactly. And that is where hope ended up. So instead of hope being outside of ourselves, we began to look at hope among us, around us, from people around us. So we started going, okay, instead of the hero that is Superman, We want more of the hero that looks like Iron Man or that looks like Batman, who is one of us, but just so happens to have like cool special genius skills.
A cool car,
right?
yes.
Exactly. And so